Hey folks, it's Finn. In this week's vlog, I'm going to address another transgender awareness topic, being that it is Transgender Awareness Month and Transgender Awareness Week. A topic I thought might be useful to discuss is gender dysphoria and exactly what that is, because I think there is a lot of confusion, misunderstanding and just not understanding at all exactly what gender dysphoria means and what it is. I think a lot of time people outside of our community kind of see transgender people as wanting to be somebody they're not. So for people like me, they see it that I thought I was male and that I wanted to be male, so therefore I transitioned to be male. And actually that contains two of the most common misconceptions of being transgender. Those two misconceptions are that we wanted to be male, female or other, and that we transitioned to be male, female or other. So in this vlog, I'm going to try to address those common misconceptions and explain gender dysphoria and gender transition. So firstly, being transgender is not about wanting to be another gender. It is actually the realisation that one is already that gender and that one's body does not match that gender. And the thing that tells this person, like told me, that I'm not the gender I was assigned at birth, is the feeling of experiencing gender dysphoria. So it is experiencing gender dysphoria that tells us we're not the gender we're assigned at birth. Making sense so far? So what is gender dysphoria? In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, gender dysphoria is listed as a marked incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and one's assigned gender. Now this all of course presents differently in different people, and different people describe it in different ways, but there are some common similarities, such as just not feeling right in one's body, in one's gender role. It goes much deeper than that, but I will put a link at the bottom to the full description of gender dysphoria and the way it presents. One important thing to note is that gender dysphoria is not a mental health problem. It's not a mental illness. It used to be listed as such. It used to be listed as gender identity disorder before 2012 this was. But it was recognised that it isn't a mental illness and that treating it as such was not helpful to anybody. This is not something that's in our heads that's making us think we're a gender we're not. This is a recognised medical condition. Although it isn't a mental health illness, of course it does have mental health issues alongside it. Because of this, the DSM-V does also state that the condition is associated with clinical distress or impairment in social, occupational or other important areas of functioning, or with a significantly increased risk of suffering such as distress or disability. Of course this makes sense, because who wouldn't feel distressed, anxious, depressed, all of the above, when living in a body that doesn't represent who you are? So what does the experience of gender dysphoria feel like? Well, as I say, it presents differently for different people, but for me, it was just this deep knowing that people weren't really seeing me in a way that I couldn't explain, and it was like this deep burning hole of something missing. My very first time I tried to put it into words was with my dad when I must have been about 8, I think. And I said to him, I don't feel right. And he asked me what I meant, and I said that I had a homesick feeling. I couldn't think of any other words to describe it, and he asked what I meant by this, and I said that I just felt like something was missing, that I should be somewhere and I wasn't there, or that I should be going somewhere and I wasn't going there, and it just felt homesick, and I didn't know why. We can only describe ourselves by the words that we have to hand, and when I was growing up, words around being transgender just were not available, and so I didn't know. I mean, it's like any condition, isn't it? You can only diagnose it if you found it in the first place. So, you know, now young people growing up, when they express the kind of things I was expressing as a child, it would be recognised as gender dysphoria and they'd be diagnosed earlier and treated earlier, but there wasn't that around when I was growing up. So I just grew up thinking there was something wrong with me in some way, that I didn't like my chest. I would just try and starve myself to keep myself thin, and I didn't know what that was about, but I knew it wasn't the same as other people that were having eating disorders. All these things now that of course in hindsight I understand, but back then was just this big ball of confusion and feeling like I was in this body and couldn't move, and feeling like I was just knocking on this pane of glass going, hello, I'm in there, and people were talking to me and not seeing the real me that I was. It was just awful. I've made sense of this in that for years and years and years I've had severe mental health problems, depression, anxiety, self-harm, addiction, eating disorders, the whole lot. And how I've come to make sense of this is that that was dysphoria untreated, because this is what happens. When you have an incongruence, these days, it's recognised. You know, there's so much more information around transgender issues, so many more people are aware of what gender dysphoria is in the medical profession, and so when somebody presents and says certain things, it rings alarm bells now that alert people that this person may well be experiencing gender dysphoria. But for me growing up, that wasn't around, and so because it went unrecognised, I spiralled into all these mental health problems. So yes, although it is not a mental health illness, untreated dysphoria will spiral into all these other mental health issues, understandably so. Addressing the second misconception, we do not transition in order to become the gender we feel ourselves to be. We transition to bring our bodies in line with the gender we already know ourselves to be. There is no change of gender. We know the gender we are. We've always been that gender. The only transition that we go through is a physical transition when our bodies are changed. That's the only thing that changes. Our bodies change to go in line with the gender we already know ourselves to be. So, to keep you up to speed, I hope you're understanding all this. So, we're first diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So we recognise that the gender we were assigned at birth is not the gender we know ourselves to be. This realisation, this diagnosis, makes us transgender. We don't decide to be transgender, as you can see. We know ourselves to be a different gender, which makes us have gender dysphoria. And then in having gender dysphoria, that makes us transgender, because the gender we experience ourselves to be is not that assigned at birth, okay? So gender dysphoria is the diagnosis. Transgender is the identity label we're given for being people that have gender dysphoria. We have gender dysphoria, therefore we are transgender. But what those two things really mean is we're male, female, or other. The gender we have does not fit with the gender we're assigned at birth, so that makes us have gender dysphoria and be transgender. But the actual thing we are is male, female, or other. Are you with me? Once we've undergone gender transition, most of us then can move into happier, healthier, wholesome lives. Of course, it can take a long time, especially for those of us that are older and have lived with gender dysphoria for longer. There's a lot more damage to undo, you know, because you start with gender dysphoria and then add to it, as I said, with all the other stuff that comes alongside because you're trying to cope with it. So as well as transitioning, I'm also dealing with all of the baggage of living in the wrong gender for a long time. So it takes a while, but yes, I've got to a point now where I can honestly say that gender dysphoria is very, very tiny in my life and just pops its head every now and again. It's like triggers from the past. Somebody's described it to me before as almost like a post-traumatic stress disorder, and so sometimes it will just be triggered out of the blue. But on the whole, yes, I would say that post-transition, I'm now just an average guy, and most of the time I don't think of myself as any different, and that's the story for most of us. So hopefully this video will give you a little bit more understanding about what it is in itself, gender dysphoria, and what it feels like to have gender dysphoria, and just clear up some of the myths and misconceptions around it. If you do have any questions, please do pop me a message in the box below, or you can send me a message over on the FinnFam or any of my social media sites. I do hope that's helped. I will return next week for the final vlog in the series about transgender awareness, and I'm going to talk about a really emotive topic of treating young people, because I know that's something that stirs up all sorts of stuff, but it needs to be talked about. So I'll see you next week for that. Have a great rest of the week and a brilliant weekend. See you next week. Bye bye.